Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. Thank you for joining us. We're continuing this journey of exploring the inequities that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also how it is that we can be involved during this legislative session to advocate for the students and schools of our Texas public schools. And so we really appreciate your time with us. Before we get started, we just want to have a quick note on our CECs, our continuing education credits. You should have received a certificate last week if you are part of a MASBA member district, or if you are a MASBA member. We sent out CEC certificates last week for the first 10 weeks of this series. And for the next 3 weeks of this series, we'll send out another certificate in another 3 weeks. If you're not yet renewed your membership, if you and or your district has not yet renewed your membership, we invite you to do so we can get those CEC certificates in your direction. One last announcement, pre-registration is open for our next MASBA conference on September the 9th through the 12th in San Antonio. We'll be back at the Wyndham San Antonio Riverwalk on September the 9th through the 12th. Our theme this year is Mas con MASBA, Mas being a double entendre, both meaning more, but also being the acronym for Mexican American Studies, an exploration of Mexican American Studies, and the featuring of MASBA's new book on the challenge of getting Mexican American Studies passed throughout these United States. Pre-registration is open through April the 30th at $200 per person for superintendents, trustees, people in our district who want to join us, and then beginning on May the 1st, it'll go up to $250. So please pre-register at the pre-registration rate of $200 through April the 30th. Now, without further ado, we'd like to invite forward the sponsor of this session. We are so grateful to our friends at E3 Integral Solutions for all that they do for our Texas public schools. Joining us today is our friend Vince Zubacek. Vince, how are you and our friends doing these days?
Doing great, Jamie. Thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of this webinar series. We are proud and honored to be a longstanding sponsor of MASBA and its efforts. Just real quickly, E3 is a Texas-based firm that helps school districts to provide energy efficiency and HVAC renovations. We've been doing it since 2009. We've worked with over 130 school districts statewide. We'd love to do a free analysis of your facilities if you're interested to see what needs might be there. And also wanted to add in one quick thing that E3 is keeping a close eye on the status of ESSER stimulus funding that's coming down from the national level and is at the state level. And so we're hearing that there will be possibly some of those funds that might be allocated towards HVAC and infrastructure. And so if your school district is interested in looking into those programs, we'd be happy to help. Let me know if there's anything else that you'd like to discuss. But with that, Jamie, again, would just like to express E3's gratitude for being a longstanding sponsor of your organization. Much appreciated.
Vince, we so greatly appreciate you and all our friends at E3. My math is not good, Vince, but I'm led to believe then that y'all have done work in nearly 10 to 15% of all Texas school districts already during these few years that y'all have been helping us here in Texas.
Yes, sir, that's correct. And we're honored that not just the number of districts that we've worked with, but also that many of those districts have done 2, 3, 4, 5 projects with us. So we're blessed.
And we love our friends at TASB, the Texas Association of School Boards. I understand there's some relationship between E3 and TASB, or am I mistaken?
That's correct. So for a long period now, I'm wanting to say it's going on 10 years, E3 has been a partner in TASB's strategic efforts to help promote facility assessments and making facilities in school districts better in the state of Texas. We are what is called an affinity partner with the Texas Association of School Boards, and we hold that partnership very dearly and are very proud of it and lucky to have it.
Awesome. Vince, thank you for joining us here today. Thank you to all our friends at E3 Integral Solutions. We just really love and appreciate y'all, not only for your support of MASBA and our programs and our scholarship program, but also for the way in which you support Texas public schools throughout the state. Y'all have been tremendous champions. We'll look forward to catching up with you at the end of the hour. Deal?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Glad to have you with us, Vince, and a special shout out to all our friends at E3 Integral Solutions. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ana Ramon from the Intercultural Development Research Association. Ana, happy Easter Monday. How are we doing today? Felices Pascuas.
Yes, happy Easter Monday. I wouldn't want to spend it with anyone else.
You are sweet as sugar. So Ana, I understand that we're in the middle of a legislative session here in Texas.
Yes, we are in almost a little past the middle of our biannual session here in Texas. It's the 87th legislature, and we're moving. And that's something we're hoping to talk about today with you, Jamie, and your members, is kind of the building blocks of the legislature, where we're at in the process, but also some really critical issues we're tracking.
Awesome. Ana, before we jump into the presentation that I understand you prepared for us, tell us about TLEC, because MASBA has been a longtime member of this, and I understand that you and our friends at IDRA have been instrumental in this partnership and this coalition. Tell us all about TLEC.
Yes, so IDRA is along with MALDEF and some original groups, founded TLEC, which is the Texas Legislative Education Equity Coalition. You know, we always love a good acronym, as MASBA does as well. And MASBA, one of the founding members of TLEC. We are a educational social justice coalition focused on public ed, everywhere from K-12 all the way to higher education in Texas, and really centering racial justice in our work. We have about 25 plus organizations, including everyone from Unidos US, LULAC, but also Houston Partnership out of Houston with family groups. We have a Rise from the Valley. We have groups from all over, not only member-based organizations, but also organizations that have like Texas chapters. So it's a very diverse coalition. We've had some nice, what we call familial fights, but on what we want to prioritize. But this session, we really laid out some key issues along not only like bilingual and emergent bilingual students and ELL students, but on top of that, you know, fair funding in schools, keeping public and public education, higher education, and also last but not least, but educational justice in our public school system. So it's quite a range of issues, and some have emerged more popular this session than others, but we're very lucky to have MASBA and other members a part of this coalition. And we've now, I think, taken a stance on at least 9 or 12 different pieces of legislation this session as a coalition.
Very nice. Somos una familia y algunas veces nos peleamos como familia también. Sometimes we fight like family, but fortunately not us on the screen or us as organizations. We just really love and appreciate you, Ana, all our friends at IDRA, all our friends now at TLEC, the Texas Legislative Education Equity Coalition.
Yes.
Before we jump into your presentation, Ana, we just want to take a moment to remind all of those who are listening to us that if they type questions into the questions box, we'll be happy to pose your questions here as part of our conversation as well. Let's get into it, Ana.
Yes, no, I'm excited to share this with y'all. And let's see, we all good on your end?
Great, looks great.
Perfect. Oops, let me minimize this.
Ana, you were working on this during Easter weekend. You are an absolute hero for doing this.
No, happy to do so. The legislature doesn't stop, and we know y'all don't either. So we want to make sure that we uplift this and all of the work that's going on in and around the Capitol. So I'll start off with a little bit about myself, and then we'll kick this started. So my name is Ana Ramon. I'm the Deputy Director of Advocacy at IDRA, and this is my 5th legislative session. I started off with Representative Joe Farias out of Bexar County, former school board member, and I was his legislative director, then chief of staff before he retired. After that, I worked for the Texas House Democratic Campaign Committee, where I was the executive director there. We worked on House races from Dallas to Alice, Texas. Got to see a lot of Texas, probably too much of Texas, but I got to work with now Senator Blanco and then Representative Justin Rodriguez before he became a commissioner in Bexar County. And then after that, I worked for Chairman Garnett Coleman out of Houston as the executive director of the Legislative Study Group. And most recently, I got to make it into the Senate. So I have some Senate experience. I was the executive director of the Texas Senate Democratic Caucus, where I worked for the now retired, but always around and in my heart, Senator Jose Rodriguez. So really excited to be here with y'all and talk about some of these building blocks, where we are in the process, and then really, really important and critical bills that we're following this session. and looking forward to any questions. I will do my best to answer. If I don't have the answer, I know that either my teammates at IDRA or TLAC will be happy to follow up with any questions you may have.
So Anna, I'm going to jump in with a question, Anna,
Sure.
then. So because we have school board members on this call, and because you worked for a former school board member who went to work in the legislature, at our MASBA conference last year, U.S. Congressman Cito Rodriguez said that serving as a school board member was the hardest elected position he ever had. He encouraged everyone present to run for future offices. Was that the experience that you saw with the former school board member with whom you worked as well?
Absolutely. It was something that really, you could tell, formulated his leadership style and how he wanted to, and what he wanted to work on the legislative process. So I'll tell you right now, a lot of y'all as school board members or admin are very familiar with the actual finance process of funding Texas schools. I say this lovingly, in the Capitol, you probably have a true handful of elected officials who have a deep understanding of the actual funding process. Most of it is, there's, great organizations like EDA and the Equity Center and Moe Casey who provide like that expert level advice and information, but to really cut through it and understand how it's going to affect the individual school districts and families and students, that was something that he was able to bring with him into the process. And yes, I don't know, maybe there's a few Harlandale ISD school board members here. He was a school board member on Harlandale ISD, especially coming out of a pretty tumultuous time. So some of the stories he told me, I was glad that I didn't have to kind of wade into those battles with him. You have a very difficult task as a school board member, not only being kind of like the chief financial officers, but being the chief education officers and really being those chief like community officers and making sure that community is part of the process. So I think it was extremely helpful in how he interacted with the legislature and really helped guide our policy priorities in the office.
Awesome. We just want to encourage all of our school board members to be running for other offices as well. How cool it would be to have former school board members and champions of public education in the legislature. Anna, yes. Take it away. Tell us all about this legislative session.
Well, just want to go over some important dates, right? So we're, as you can see, right in the middle of it. March 12th was the 60-day bill filing deadline, so no more bills can be introduced. And our next major date is adjournment. So sine die when the legislative session will end. At this point, we are, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth, but where we're at in the process is we're kind of wrapping up hearings in their individual bodies. So the Senate bills are starting to wrap up in the Senate and the House bills are starting to wrap up in the House. And now we're getting into a different part of session, right? When we start having these longer floor debates, which we often see covered, and conversations on either very controversial bills or bills that have to pass. So this is where we're at in the process. We're now in what we would call the sprint after the April break, right? The Easter break. This is going to be the kind of roughest part of session, which is this sprint to get bills passed, amendments fixed, the budget passed. And we'll talk a little bit about why the timeline's a little skewed this session as well. So yeah, there's some interesting things going on in the process that wouldn't normally happen during session. And what we already know too is that we will definitely have a special session on redistricting. I know that in a previous session for MASBA, you had Chairman Anchia on and Representative Van Dever and talked about that, but for sure there will be a special session in September, and there could potentially be some other special sessions on other key critical issues for Texas. So those are those important dates, but to point out something kind of like a little insider, June 20th, as you can see, is the deadline for the governor to sign or veto. So the likelihood of a special session being set right after we sine die on May 31st is very, very rare, because what the House does have the capability and the Senate have the capability to do is actually counter vetoes. So often the governor will he will request a special session after that June 20th deadline. So no need to rush back, hopefully right after session, but that's something that we'll be keeping our ear to the ground and closely monitoring after we sine die on May 31st. So lots to take in, but really want to talk about, oh, were you gonna ask a question, Jamie?
No, it
Or
looks fantastic. No, I love when you advance to this slide on committee work. I know many of our friends on the call here are looking at the work of various committees. So tell us all about what's happening in committees.
yes, so right now, as I mentioned, we're in the process of senators and the Senate committees wrapping up what bills they're here in the Senate. Specifically, their members' bills, and the House and House committees are looking to wrap up hearing bills on the House side. So what this means is House bills will no longer be heard in the House, and they'll start to hear Senate bills, and Senate bills will no longer be heard in the Senate, and House bills will be taken up. So you're going to start seeing this crossover of bills into the opposing chamber. As most of you know, right, a bill has to go through both chambers before it can ever be sent to the governor's desk. So right now we're in that process. Bills have been referred. Bills are continuously being referred, but if anyone's following bills right now and you don't have a bill that's being set either this week or next week for a hearing, the likelihood of that bill passing unfortunately plummets. So we can talk a little bit about alternatives, right? Like other ways that you can tack on language or legislation, but these next 2 weeks are so critical if you're working on legislation and you're really hoping to get a bill passed. It has to be heard in the next, either this week or next week. So speaks to why we had a lot of work over the Easter holiday, and also to the fact that this session in particular, and we're going to talk about barriers a little later, has been slower to get started than previous sessions, and how that's kind of starting to create a bottleneck of bills. So if you have a bill that's been voted out of committee, on the House side, it's sent to the calendar committee. On the Senate side, it's sent to the Lieutenant Governor's office, and then each individual senator can choose how many bills they put on the intent calendar for the Lieutenant Governor to take up. So complicated processes on both, but I think what's important to point out is the House committee is made up of 12 members. They all vote on them as a body, whereas on the Senate side, the power is really focused and centered with Lieutenant Governor Patrick. And also, you know, the members themselves, the senators, have to request that the bill be placed on intent, and they only have a certain amount of bills to do that. So that's another way that those senators will prioritize their bill. And last but not least, after the committee process, you get into the floor action. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But once the bill hits the floor, it's up for debate, right? And this is potential amendments, questions, asking for intent. So this is kind of like how the bill gets started, then how it's in the committee, and then finally where it's sent. And the goal, right, on both sides of the chambers, or both chambers, is making sure that you get floor action on a bill. And this is where we're at. So I wanted to kind of show where we're at currently in session. That's this growth in calendars, right? So on the House side, you have the general calendar where most bills will tend to go. You have a few other calendars, like major state calendar, and then you have like you have a speaker's, I almost said speaker Strauss, a couple speakers ago, Speaker Phelan's priorities, and what he wants to see get passed through the House. And on the Senate, right, as I mentioned, you have bills that are now being voted out of the Senate committees, the substantive committees, and they're being placed on the intent calendar for full, you know, review and hopefully placement or calling up by Lieutenant Governor Patrick. If you have any questions about either of those processes, I'm happy to go them in depth. Again, very lucky and blessed that I was able to have both House and Senate experience. And I'll tell you, I was shocked at how different the process in both chambers are. But at this point in session, where we're at is bills are starting to be filtered to the floor for full debate, right, of each of the bodies. What we are also seeing more on the House side, I would say, is just because so few bills are moving, you have more opportunities for amendments and amendments happening. So if you have concerns or questions, and this is what I mentioned a little earlier, if maybe your bill's not moving or you're working on legislation that's not moving, this is the opportune time to look for bills that are, and that you can try to find germane amendments to place onto those bills. If you have questions about what that looks like and how to prioritize that, we're happy to go through that with y'all. That's something that we're working with not only our TLUC members, but also internally. How do we make sure that good legislation gets tacked on or added on in these opportune moments? But to really highlight where we're at, in most sessions, you'll have upwards of 7,500 bills filed. which it sounds a lot. It is a lot. You have about 7,500 bills filed. You have about 1,500 bills that will actually make it through the process all the way to the governor's desk. This time around, we're expecting that number to be significantly lower. You know, there's been comments made, something as specific as every senator besides the chairman may only have 3 to 5 bills pass. And on the House side, right, we're seeing much smaller House calendars this time around than we would on a typical session. So we'll talk about that a little later when it comes to barriers, but this session is definitely unique and will probably be one of, I'll make a prediction here in my legislative crystal ball, probably one of the lowest bill passing rates in the last couple of sessions, if not the last decade. So lots of questions, a lot of stuff in the air, but this is where we're at in the process, really trying to push bills now to the full debate in front of both the full Senate and the full House so they can start to cross over into the opposing chamber. The budget. This is something that is hypercritical. It's critical every session, right? But to give y'all an idea of the budget process, it doesn't start when session starts, right? The budget is about a year out, right, from session is when the Legislative Budget Board, which is guided by 3 ex officio members, right? So that's Lieutenant Governor Patrick, that's the Speaker of the House, and the Governor, start to put together what they propose is going to be that next biennial or the next biennium budget. This is the only bill that constitutionally has to pass. When we were first taking up the budget, just to give you a bit of a timeline, the budget itself was about 4 months behind. I've never seen a budget pass out in my 4 or now 5 sessions. I've not seen a budget pass out of its opposing chambers this late. And we'll talk a little bit about the timeline later that we're seeing and hearing. But this is that critical piece. This is something that if it doesn't pass, which there were rumors at one point the budget may not make it this session just because of how much work has to take place, you're talking about hundreds of steps, right, that the budget has to go through. On the House side, you have House appropriations, and I know for y'all, it's very critical to know who those Article 3 members are, right? So the chairman of Article 3, the members of Article 3 in the budget are really going to be deciding, and they have decided, right, what items are going to be in the decision documents or amended onto the budget when it comes to amendments and riders, et cetera. So that process is currently taking place in the House. On a Senate side, they've actually already adopted all of their recommendations or the recommendations made to Article 3 and all the other subsequent articles. So the Senate, I would say, is about a couple of weeks ahead of the House at this point, and we'll talk a little bit more about timeline. But what's important to note here is the budget is really one of those, and I'm going to say this a couple of times, big moving ships that people are really looking at potentially interacting with and trying to amend, because the opportunities for other legislative unfortunately, the other opportunities for like legislative actions, right, like traditional bills and amendments is so tampered down this session. So if you have questions about the budget process, really it's going to be a bit more opaque as we head into session. As you can imagine, meetings will be taking place and a lot of conversations are happening now in the foreground just because of how quickly they have to move the budget. So a lot of questions, a lot of concerns here, especially as now we're facing this influx of federal dollars, which we'll talk about also a little bit later. This is something that is, I would say, like, raise your hand if you've ever worked with a conference committee or been on, interacted with conference committees. Conference committees are not a well-known part of the session, but I would say for this session, conference committees will be even more critical to note in who they are. So you have large bills that are moving, and we'll talk about those. You have very large bills that are moving, and essentially what a conference committee is, say you have a bill that has passed through both chambers, and there are been substantive changes made to that bill, right? So, maybe Representative Ramon, myself passed a bill and Senator, Matthias took it over and he's like, you know what, I'm going to add these 4 amendments and we'll work it out in conference. Well, what that means is, he has his priorities, I have my priorities. Will they match up in conference? So each chamber is able, and those different authors are able to name who their conferees will be. So myself, like I would name myself and probably 3 other conferees that I know will be with me, because I know that they're with me in my priorities. And then Senator Matthias will name himself and then several other people to be his conferees. And those members will meet. Often it's led by the different opposing authors, by the main author in the Senate and the main author in the House. And they essentially have a mediation. Some of these are easier than others, but when you're talking about omnibus bills, or even more importantly, the budget, having that amount of power and say is often really critical, who your conferees are and then who's leading those conversations. So because this session is such a limited session and how you're able to pass legislation, conference committees that are named are even more critical to note, and who they are and how you're going to interact with them, and how you can even make sure that they know like what your priorities are, right, headed into session or headed into the conference. So really wanted to make sure that, if you're looking at a bill and it's late in the process and you hear that it's going to be sent to conference, that's when my first question will be, who are the conferees on both the House and the Senate, and how do we make sure they know what our priorities are and make sure that anything we have in this legislation is protected? Because what will happen in conference is things can be stripped. Things can, I don't know technically if things can be added, but things can definitely be stripped. So say, like I mentioned, Senator Matthias has 4 amendments and Mazba is all behind 2 of them, but they both get stripped. All of your work, right, on that bill could literally be taken out of the process. So conference committees, very, very critical. If there's any that pop up and we need actions and have people reach out to them, that's something that I know TLUC is going to be working on, especially for some of these larger bills, likely also very much so for the budget this time around, which I believe is the House version. So this is just something I've been trying to, whenever I give a presentation, I always try to let people know about conference committees, especially this session, and how critical they're going to be. And here we go, the House versus the Senate. Working in both, I have a little bit of knowledge now in both sides and how they interact and work. The House has traditionally been a stopgap, right? I think a lot of y'all have seen some of the worst legislation maybe passed over from the Senate get stopped or bottlenecked in the House. This time around, the process is a little different. So what we've been essentially told is on the House side, if something is sent to calendars, the likelihood that it goes to the floor is really, really high, right? So traditionally, like we talked about, right, a bill on the House side gets voted out of calendars and it gets voted out of committee and sent to the calendar committee that will decide what bills the entire process or the entire body will hear. That is no longer the case. So what we've been told is on the House side, and again, this is a lot of us trying to figure out how the process has shifted over the last couple of months, but on the House side, if something's sent to calendars, the likelihood that it gets to the floor is very, very high. So the House isn't acting as traditionally that stopgap from any bills that may be of concern. So that's an interesting process. You also have just totally new leadership, right? So Speaker Phelan, for example, has a totally different way in trying to interact with the process, but also dealing with, COVID and other barriers, which we'll discuss. So that's a major change in the House, and seeing how they interact. There is some things that we're closely tracking that we'll talk about, just these major bills and how they're going to be moving over in the next couple of weeks, really, and then you have major leadership changes, right? So that has been a lot to track, right? New chairman of public education, new chairman of higher education, new chairman of appropriations. So anytime that there's a new speaker, added, or a new speaker who's voted by the full body, you will have a complete leadership change. So not only is the House dealing with a major leadership change, they're dealing with, now the barriers of session, which we'll talk about as well. And on the Senate, it's a little bit more kind of business as usual. You have Lieutenant Governor Patrick, who is still the president of the Senate. The Lieutenant Governor voted on, statewide and elected, and most of the chairmen, if not all, stayed the same. There was a few shifts committees, like the creation of a jurisprudence committee, or I think the bringing back of the jurisprudence committee, and then the tax The state taxpayer committee was dissolved since they weren't working on legislation specific to that. So there was some changes, but ultimately leadership has stayed the same in the Senate. So you can tell like huge new changes in the House with leadership and priorities, in the Senate, right? A little bit more business as usual with Patrick continuing that leadership and staying the same. So very interesting opposing bodies. And I think what's important to note here, right? And you have a little insider tea, right? The House, you have 150 members. That is a lot of priorities and people and stuff to work with. On the Senate, right, you're talking about 31 members. While very powerful, arguably, you know, they have districts as large as congressional districts, right? So arguably some of the most powerful people in the state having to work together, right, with these different priorities and changes in leadership. So it's been interesting to see these bodies work. There has been quite a bit of changing and shifting, especially on the House side, but just note, right, any bill, like I mentioned, has to go through both. So they'll have to work together, which on some issues can be easier than others. And it's been interesting to watch that kind of layout, but really critical to note that, you know, the Senate and the House are not, I think the best way to put it are frenemies, right? They will come together when they need to, but ultimately they have different sets of priorities. So this is a critical thing I wanted to talk about. I know I've mentioned it a little bit throughout the presentation. There's been some major barriers to session, right? So on top of having, you know, COVID-19 really determine a lot of the responses and what electeds are able to work on, and even the process itself, you have not only that, but you have the access to the Capitol and what traditionally would have been advocacy and lobbying and just really dismantling what a traditional legislature looks like. You also have then the actual snowvid, right, or the winter storm thrown in. So COVID-19 has definitely dictated parts of the education bills that we've been tracking for sure. There's some interesting things out there that we'll discuss a little bit later, but on top of everything else, right, there was so much concern when the first biennial estimate from the comptroller came out, right? I think some of you may have remembered that there was over close to $5 billion projected shortfall, and now that we have some influx of federal dollars, that has kind of dissipated a lot of that. But now there's conversations not only in education, but telehealth, and, you know, how do we increase broadband, and some of the things we'll talk about. So that has been such a big moving ship, and something that is been critical to kind of the responses and what's getting heard on the floor, right? Because people do want to be responsive to the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic. Access to the Capitol has been incredibly difficult. This is something that we work in larger coalition space, not only with TLEC, but also a coalition that every Texan is running, and really looking at how can we make sure that community voice isn't lost in the process. Because as you can imagine, right, asking people who would traditionally have gone and provide testimony to enter a building, which unfortunately, you know, could be, you know, easily a spreader situation or expose someone to COVID-19, has been a huge barrier for us, right? Because we don't want to make anyone feel like they have to do it. But on top of that, what we've been hearing, right, is that the balance of testimony has very much shifted. So on the House side, right, you have the public comment portal, which we have been utilizing. What we understand is electeds really see that as an opportunity to hear from their constituents. So if you have a bill and it's something that you're concerned about, putting in comments to that portal has been somewhat successful. Larger coalition letters on the Senate side with multiple signers that people can reach out to and contact has been successful with the Senate, because the Senate has even less than the House does when it comes to being able to actually get in and provide public comments or witness testimony on bills. So happy to work through that. I'm going to talk about an opportunity that we've been doing weekly and we'll be doing later today, trying to help people connect, right, and figure out what makes sense for them when they're trying to come into session and approach it. And then the winter storm. I'm sure some of y'all heard about the marathon hearings, literally 18-hour hearings around ERCOT. The House has passed out the majority of their ERCOT bills. That was last week. So quite a bit of movement there. And the Senate has also passed out ERCOT bills trying to address the pay rates and how to approach this moving forward. And yeah, it's been a very complicated, I'm very appreciative that I don't have to follow that very closely, but as you can imagine, like those bills were prioritized, very quickly became part of the legislative packages by both Speaker Phelan and Lieutenant Governor Patrick. So that, again, if you think about that timeline, squish the timeline down even further. So yes, we were already 4 months behind when it came to the budget. We were months behind when it came to just hearing bills, and that storm set us back a good week or two and made it very difficult to interact with, even more so, right, to try to get bills and things that we're tracking moving. So that has been a major barrier this session to trying to move what would be like traditional legislation. And really want to highlight this, the top 5 issues to know this session and where we're at and how we're going to be tracking them. As I mentioned, right, this has been a pretty historic session. You do have things that, you have your traditional outline priorities by the governor and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Phelan, but then you have our priorities, right? Like, what are we tracking that makes sense for not only a reaction to COVID-19, but also, what's kind of on the top of the ticket for legislators and on, as advocates in education. So really excited to share this with you, and these will hopefully continue to move. Some of them are moving faster than others, but we're really excited to share this with you and definitely try to connect you with opportunities to make sure that we're pushing unilaterally, especially this session and how difficult it's been. So first and foremost, this is one of those critical issues that I know that not only MASBA and TLEC and IDRA have been at the forefront of, but we English language learners, and as we refer to them, emergent bilingual students, has been something that has not been able to catch wind, but it's a priority for us because we know it's one of the fastest growing populations in the state. There's not only opportunities, right, to help promote and build these students, but also even to bring funds into schools, right, based on formula funding and opportunities. And it's just been something that is, even last session, right, when House Bill 3 was moving, just wasn't an interest, at least at the time, with the House Bill 3 authors to kind of increase that formula funding for English language learners and making sure that resources were being delegated appropriately to these populations. And it's a priority for us because, as you can imagine, right, during the COVID-19 response, the students that were most affected, unfortunately, were not only students of color, but especially these English language learners. So this is critical in our work and trying to get things moving for them. There is a bill that's coming up, which is a bilingual educator, a bilingual special education teacher certification. It's set for a hearing tomorrow. If there's any interest in showing support or dropping a card for that bill, that's something that we're working in coalition with Texas Care for Children, IDRA, obviously, and a few other organizations who are really trying to get some of these bills moving. And we'll talk a little bit more about the bills that are out there. That's my next slide. But we also, if this is helpful to y'all in your work, we have created one-pagers for all of the House and I believe House and Senate education committee members on what their populations of bilingual students look like in their districts. So if those are tools that we can help equip you all with, it's really fighting this political, like the lack of political will to help and move on bilingual educator or bilingual students, right? And this is something that, there's session fatigue, right? There's issue fatigue. Often, the sessions will have themes and there's interests that will make more sense to the members. And for us, it's so critical to make sure that we continue to work on behalf of our English language learner students, because they're often those that kind of are not at the forefront of these conversations when you're talking about increased formula funding or trying to provide additional protections and support for them, especially coming out of COVID-19. So this is critical for us. We're going to continue to work on our package and I'll go ahead and move to that slide. So these are several bills that we're part of a larger coalition space that work with philanthropy advocates, like I mentioned, Texans Care for Children and IDRA, where we're really trying to push some of these bills to get a hearing. So House Bill 2256 by GETA, right, as I mentioned, is that bilingual SPED certification, and it does have a Senate companion. That's another thing to note. If you're working on legislation or bills that do not have either a House companion, if it's a Senate bill, or a Senate companion if it's a House bill, that has also been a huge barrier, right, this session. So be mindful of that if you're working on legislation and how you can continue to promote, right, your legislative agenda. But so that's something that we were trying to, the people who worked on this, I'm more secondary on this project, but these are critical English language learner bills to know that we're going to be pushing this session. And while it's a very expansive group of bills, we know that getting them all past this session even more so would be difficult. It's something that we're going to continue to push and make this unilateral push and try to change some of the political will around English language learners or emerging bilingual students. So there are other opportunities, right? There's some action alerts that I'm happy to send to Vincent and to Dr. Matthias on these bills, and really hopeful that some of them will get moving. Like I mentioned, we have House Bill 2256 set for a hearing tomorrow. So if anyone is wanting to help and support that, please let me know. And I'm happy to connect you with our folks at IDRA and Texans Care for Children. Broadband. This has been one of the bills that we've been really excited to see some movement on. So Senator Nichols has SB6 on the Senate side, and that's most recently been voted out actually out of the full Senate. And House Bill 6 by Representative Ashby has been voted out of the House State Affairs Committee. So hopefully it'll hit the House floor soon. And then, as I mentioned, right, you'll start to see these bills cross. You know, it was interesting to hear some of the testimony around this, and even testimony during Commissioner Murat's presentation to appropriations on the House side and Senate Finance on the Senate side. You know, 45% of students across Texas are still virtual. They're called Zoomies, I hope lovingly, by TA, and Roomies, people who are in person. So you still have a huge population that is receiving virtual learning. And what we know, right, one of those stopgaps and the last mile is often required, as it's stated, is broadband and access. So we were early on trying to talk to Senator Nichols about making sure public education and education needs are centered in that bill. There has been some positive movement there and how they would approach it, and making sure that, you know, there's a council that they would be talking to, essentially, that would include people who are individuals who would be able to give recommendations, who are part of the public education process. And then what they're looking at is block grant funding, right, that they would utilize, and also, you know, include public education as one of those markers. But essentially what these bills would do is create a state broadband plan, which we're one of only 6 states in the nation not to have one. And as you can imagine, I'm sure you have, you know, as admin members and as school board members, you've probably heard quite a bit about this and what this looks like. And since we don't have that state broadband plan, it essentially takes away points for how we get graded, right, when we request federal dollars. So this would create that broadband plan, a department essentially that would help draw down federal dollars, billions of federal dollars essentially. And while we have received dollars in the past, this would make it easier, right, for the federal government to, you know, help us acquire that. So what we've been really focused on here is making sure that, of course, you know, rural membership is crucial. That's where that infrastructure gap lies, but not to lose sight that, you know, urban districts are also just as hard as hit as hard, right, by the broadband issue as any other part of the state. So, like, for example, like SEISD, you know, we in the ACS data, we saw that there was like 108,000 households that were surveyed that didn't have access to internet, and that was about 21% of the district. So like 3/4 of the 3/4 of the 20 million American households who lack house broadband or mobile data, the biggest urban counties, like that, there is about 590,000 households without internet subscription. So when we're talking about broadband, right, this is of course a rural issue. Absolutely, there's infrastructure needs that have to take place to get to that, with the quote unquote last mile, but there's also major needs in our urban cores. So we've been talking a lot with our House members and the wonderful leadership at the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, and making sure that when we're talking about broadband, that we're not losing sight of all students, right, and all needs that are across. So that has been something that we've been monitoring. And while SB 6 and House Bill 6 have been the largest or the biggest moving ships, there are other bills that are kind of popping up that we're trying to monitor. And for us, it's, yes, of course, making sure that, like I mentioned, urban communities are included, but also that community voice is included. I will say this, there are some concerns. The House bill and the Senate bill have changed quite a bit from each other. They started off very close language-wise, so they were very, very similar. Now they're not even considered similar bills, as in the language has shifted so far from each other that they're kind of moving in their own silos. That is very concerning. Anyone who follows legislative process, right, when you have bills that should be technically kind of like twin bills or you know, kind of similar to each other, start to move away, it gives you an idea that the priorities, as I mentioned, right, between the House and the Senate may be shifting, and that this will be one of those bills that goes to conference and will be hashed out in conference. So this is kind of, I guess, kind of the case study to a lot of what I mentioned earlier. But for us, it's going to be making sure that, you know, urban and rural and all students across Texas have access to broadband, because as is mentioned, the need is still there, right? 45% of students are still receiving education virtually, and we know that unfortunately this has the greatest impact on Black and Brown students, especially bilingual students. So this is something that really wanted to highlight with you all.
Anna, with 10 minutes left, do you mind if we just pause and take 2 quick questions from trustees before we go through the last 3?
Of course.
Trustee Janet Veracruz from Duncanville ISD is wondering how or where we can support some of the bills that we saw on the previous slide. She was particularly interested in supporting HB 2256. Any quick note on how we can support anything that we're seeing here?
Yes, and I'd be happy to send an email to you, Jamie, with this information. One, you can absolutely submit those public comments, right, in support of the bill, and I'll send the specific link where you can send in your comments, and that would be phenomenal. And on top of that, I'll make sure that I forward on an action alert that we're utilizing through this larger coalition. So if you want to continue to stay involved with those bills, I'll make sure that you're connected with those resources.
Tremendous. And Trustee Trish Bodie of the Leander ISD is asking, with the bills that we saw set out with the proposed legislation, any word on the unfunded mandates that might be created by any of that legislation, Anna?
With these bills, or?
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
And for instance,
yes. So I will say this: any bill that is created has to have a fiscal note attached to it, and unless there's a rider, especially this session, unless there's a rider, there's essentially a moratorium on any bills that have any additional costs. So if the bill gets passed and it cannot be something that's funded by either existing funds within TA, or if there's not a rider associated with it, you know, which would receive funds through the budget allocated to these specific bills, the likelihood of them passing is nil, it's 0. So, and that's something that I know we've been really critical about this session, more so than any session really, but we wouldn't anticipate any unfunded mandates, because we're actively working on making sure that there's funding with anything that's passed and needs funding to be implemented.
There we go. Certainly as school board members, I know all of us are interested in knowing, you know, is the state going to be imposing something on us and on our districts without giving us the money to be able to do it? So unfunded mandates are always a concern.
Oh no, and I'll tell you, our coalition is also not a fan of unfunded mandates. So that's not anything that we would hope to put on y'all as a burden, but also really happy to hear any feedback or concerns, since, as I mentioned, right, when all the way back when I mentioned I work for Representative Fahey as a former school board member, we don't necessarily always know what the on the ground impact is. So that's something that we would love to work with y'all on.
Awesome. And we just want to thank Trustee Bodie is pointing out that HB 41, for instance, has a fiscal note that would presumably be covered by districts. So, hopefully we are, of course, hopeful that the legislature will address various issues like that.
Yes, and at this point, I don't anticipate that bill getting a hearing. I think it was something that was part of the package, but I'm happy to clarify any questions and get that y'all's way and connect y'all with our teammates who have been working on that.
Awesome. Anna, 3 more points to go. Take it away.
Yes. So as I mentioned, right, there's some interesting bills around the hybrid model itself, virtual schools, and these are bills that we've been monitoring. We call them COVID response bills, essentially. There hasn't been too much movement. I know in the House public education hearing last week, there was some bills that would try to look at expanding virtual schools. And it's been interesting. I think it's a lot of learning as we go. But I will tell y'all, we are very concerned about any expansion of virtual school networks in particular, because we know that they're not, necessarily the most, they're not really the most effective way to educate students. But I think it's a sign that virtual or hybrid models are here to stay, at least for the time being. So we were really excited to see the hold harmless implemented by, Commissioner Morath earlier this session. And some of the things that we're just concerned here is, making sure that the recourses of the pandemic don't have any impact on the actual monies that are being sent to the ISDs. So that's something that we're monitoring very closely here, and we'll continue to do so. But this one hasn't gained too much traction. I think the reason that we're monitoring these bills so closely is because it would change a bit some of the landscape of what traditional public schools would look like. So if there's any interest on any of these bills, please let us know, and we'll try to connect. But yeah, these are just critical to note, as I mentioned, because of like the actual changes in what this would mean for schools moving forward. What we have seen this session has been an increase in district accountability bills. We know that school takeovers don't work and they will not work, and we need to make sure that we elevate, not stifle, community voices. So we heard, House Bill 3270, which was very much a response, I think, to what's going on with Houston ISD last week. TLEC, submitted comments against that bill. And we just have seen an increase in these bills receiving hearings. Will they move? That's still a case to be seen, but at this point, it's something that we call district health. We want to make sure that anything that is imposed, as mentioned, onto districts is not something that would create any opportunities for school board takeovers or takeovers in general, since that's something that would literally strip community voice and community participation from the process. So we are going to be monitoring these very closely. We have opposed most of them with TLEC, and it's something that as they start to move between the chambers, we'll have a better understanding of if this is something that both sides are willing or looking to pass and sent to the governor's desk. But the range of bills on these issues have been pretty interesting. There was even a Senate bill, right, that would create like an inspector general office within TA that would literally, provide investigative opportunities against districts. So, but this is something that is a TLEC priority. As I mentioned, like the Houston parent group actively working against this, and Arise and other groups that we work with who are very concerned, teacher groups that we work with, very concerned about these bills, because we, amongst many, do not want to see community voice stifled in any way under the guise of, making schools better, which we know is just not the case. There's plenty of data to support that.
Tremendous. MASBA voiced its opposition to that last week as well. We want all our friends to know, but we are on the edge of our seat. What is number one, Anna, as we begin to close out today?
Number one is the budget, right? You're talking about $251 billion. The budget is a huge monster of a bill, And while the base budgets for both the House and the Senate are very, very similar, what we have seen is this unknown about how federal dollars are going to be used. And then both the House and the Senate have decided not to take up the recommendation of the supplemental funding request that TEA had for COVID-19 response. So there's a lot of unknowns on how like federal aid is going to be utilized. There's anticipated, I believe it was like 17 billion or at least 2.5 billion dollars that are going to be sent to Texas for federal funds, and that we'll see come into the state. So there's the questions I think that arise here. I know some folks are familiar with like the 2009, 2011 situation, right, where 2009 we did receive federal aid, and unfortunately that led to 2011 budget cuts because of funding mechanisms that weren't one-time expenditures. So that is a major concern, because 2022, the budget that's being written right now is 2022 and 2023. So that is, I'm sorry, is that right? Yes, 2022 and 2023. The next biennium is what budget writers are really concerned about, and that's the 2024-2025, because though that's the biennium, they don't know how COVID-19 and now the snowstorm and everything is going to affect, and if that would lead to that same kind of situation of 2009 to 2011, and now would be 2021 to 2023, that would lead to budget cuts to that 2024-2025 biennium. A little complicated, I understand, but it's so critical for us to be able to monitor this and understand what, like, not only the state would be on the hook for, but what the superintendent, the board member from Leander ISD mentioned, what's going to be pushed down right onto the actual districts. Because as we've seen, that trajectory of monies that is being depreciated from the state and then the cost being pushed down onto the actual districts is so scary, and something that we want to stay on top of, especially going into this unknown biennium. Not this one, right? I think because we do work differently than other states. We do bienniums before, but it's going to be that 2024-2025 budget that I think is going to be crucial, and where potential cuts could be if we're not smart about how federal aid is distributed. And I'll tell you point blank, right, our priorities for federal aid is making sure that it goes to students who are most in need, and that's, you know, students of color, but also like English language learners and vulnerable students, whether homeless, foster care, etc. So there are mechanisms to do that. TLEC is working on a letter that we plan to send to Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and the commissioners respectively, Commissioner Morath and Commissioner Keller. So be on the lookout for that. We're trying to take in final comments, but and thank you for pointing out some of those things about the other bills. It's something I'm happy to elevate with our team, because for us, the last thing we want to do is put anyone at a disadvantage, right? Especially heading into what is a bit of the unknown, and how, you know, COVID-19 and all those other barriers are going to be affecting us in the next couple of years. And just quickly, I'll just throw these up on the screen. These are upcoming bills for this week. As I mentioned, there's a couple that, you know, aren't set for hearings, but we're trying to get them set. And then these are some of the bills that are going to be heard in public education and higher, and actually Homeland Security. Sometimes bills like this pop up where opposed to carrying possession of a handgun by a public junior college marshal. And then just some other bills. These are all bills that we'll be supporting come actually tomorrow in public education hearing. The majority of them, some of them are opposed. And then I'll just throw this up on the screen. We do have these virtual office hours. I'll make sure that's in my follow-up email with Jamie and our Dr. Matthias. And if people have interest in, you know, actually submitting comments, especially on the bill that we mentioned, House Bill 2256, would love to help support that. And that's it. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Anna, you are tremendous. Thank you for giving us an update. We know that this legislative session is absolutely on fire and is going forward. So I really appreciate your willingness to be with us to give us a quick update after this Easter weekend. Thank you for working through the Easter weekend on this presentation, be able to give us an idea of what are the issues that are most impacting the Latino students, or the majority of our Texas public schools, and the emergent bilinguals. Now we're calling our English language learners. I love that new inclusive name, emergent bilingual students, who are expected to be 25% of our Texas public schools by 2025. Anna, thank you. To you and all our friends at IDRA and TLAC, really appreciate your willingness to give us a prize. I understand you'll come back and join us in 2 more weeks.
Yes, and I will definitely bring some TLAC friends with me that time.
Awesome. Anna, thank you. Really appreciate your time. As we invite Vince to join us again, I just want to remind all of our viewers that next week, Dr. Phil Gore of TASB will be with us, reflecting on good governance and what we've learned about good governance during this past year. Vince, thanks for joining us again, and thanks for your sponsorship of this session. Any thoughts and or perspectives? And then we'll give you a chance to have final words, Vince.
No, just great info from Anna. Anybody here living in the state, it's great perspective to hear what's going on in our legislature from people like Anna who know and can understand and share that with folks like me that don't understand it as well. So I really appreciate just being part of this webinar series and hearing the information that you're presenting to your members. And again, thanks for the sponsorship, or for the opportunity to sponsor your organization.
Our pleasure, Vincent. Thanks again to you. I know that your parents both worked in public education for years and years and years, so I know that that's something that's dear to your heart.
Yes, sir. Combined over 80 years between mom and dad.
That's a long time. Really appreciate your support of our Texas Public Schools, Vince. Please share our gratitude with all our friends at E3 Integral Solutions. To all those who are with us, if you have any HVAC needs and or are looking to maximize the savings with respect to facilities costs so that you can direct more toward the students, please contact our friends at E3 Integral Solutions. We'll be back next Monday at this new link. Have a great day, y'all.